Welcome. Two shadows never sleep. Here night never ends. And every story hides something waiting to be found. From haunted houses buried deep in forgotten American towns, to Halloween nights that went horribly wrong, and old legends whispered by those who claimed they saw something right before the lights went out. So sit back, turn off the lights, and let the shadows tell you what they've been keeping. It began with a scream no one wanted to admit they heard. Neighbors said the sound could have been a radio, a slammed door, or just the pipes moaning through the old house on East New York Street. But those who lived closest remembered that night differently. They remembered a sound that didn't belong to anything ordinary, thin, human, and terrified, echoing up through the floorboards and out into the humid Indiana air. The house looked harmless, pale siding, the paint beginning to peel. A front porch crowded with children's shoes, and a bicycle missing one pedal. Behind the curtained windows glowed a weak yellow light that never seemed to go out. Every evening, that light flickered as though the bulb was fighting to stay alive. When Sylvia Likens first stepped through that front door in the summer of 1965, she could not have imagined how much of herself she would leave behind in that place. 16 years old, quiet and kind, she carried more responsibility than most adults. A girl who smiled easily and apologized too often. Her parents were carnival workers, moving from town to town chasing a living when the traveling season began. They arranged for Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny to stay with a woman named Gertrude Benishevsky. To their parents, it seemed an act of kindness, a safe home, meals, a roof, other children to keep them company. On that first day, the house smelled of dust and cigarette smoke. A thin woman with tired eyes greeted them at the door. The walls were lined with faded photographs, and the air felt heavy, as though it hadn't been opened in months. Sylvia smiled politely, clutching her suitcase to her chest. Jenny stood half hidden behind her. Outside, life went on. Radios hummed from open windows. Children rode bikes down cracked sidewalks. Dogs barked at mailmen. But inside, something about that house felt off. Sylvia would later tell a friend that the place was too quiet for how many people lived in it. Gertrude had 7 children of her own. The rooms were small, their beds pressed close together, the air always thick with noise and chaos. Yet, under all of that, a strange stillness lived, the kind that made the hairs on your arm rise for no reason. Weeks passed. The sisters attended the local church, sometimes went to the park. Sylvia laughed easily, made quick friends, but always seemed distracted, as if her mind kept returning to that basement door she had seen half open at the end of the hallway. She said once, jokingly, that it looked like something out of a ghost story, a single wooden door leading down into darkness, colder air drifting from the crack at its bottom. At night, when the house settled, she could hear the faint rattle of pipes below. Sometimes a drip of water, sometimes a creak like footsteps that stopped as soon as she listened too closely. The neighbors would recall later that strange things began happening around that time. Letters from Sylvia's parents arrived later and later. Some were never delivered. The girls began to look thinner, quieter. They still smiled when spoken to, but there was something forced about it, a kind of practiced calm, the way people smile when they're trying not to show fear. The house became a place of whispered questions. Children from down the street said they didn't like walking past it at dusk because they could feel cold air on the sidewalk. A mail carrier mentioned once that the curtains never moved even when the windows were open. And always, there was that light, the one in the back room that never seemed to turn off, no matter the hour. Inside, Sylvia tried to keep her sense of hope. She drew small hearts in the margins of old magazines, helped the younger kids with their homework, and told her sister that their parents would be back soon. She wanted to believe that goodness still existed in that house, but goodness has a way of fading when no one feeds it. One evening, when the air outside smelled like rain and rust, Sylvia went to throw out the trash. She lifted the lid of the old metal bin and froze. Inside was a bundle of paper, torn letters, burned at the edges, her mother's handwriting barely visible through the ash. She touched the edge and watched it crumble to dust. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn quickly, but the yard was empty. The back door, however, had closed on its own. From that night on, Sylvia started to hear things, a faint whispering beneath the floorboards. Sometimes her name, drawn out in a sigh. She told herself it was imagination, exhaustion, maybe even the wind. But the fear was real. You could see it in the way she hesitated before answering calls from the basement, or how she jumped whenever the pipes groaned. In town, people began to gossip. They said the Benishevsky house was cursed. Someone swore they saw a shadow move behind the curtains, long after everyone was asleep. Another claimed that a child's voice was crying from inside when no one was home. One knocked on the door to check. Months later, when police would finally walk into that house, they would write that it felt colder than it should have, a chill that came from somewhere deeper than the earth. But that was long after the neighbors had grown used to pretending they heard nothing. The first time Sylvia's friend Paula came to visit, she said, the air in the hallway felt wrong, like breathing through a wet cloth. She stayed only 15 minutes and left without finishing her drink, and then came the silence. The house that once echoed with children's voices grew quieter each day. The laughter stopped. Even the radios that blared country music in the evenings fell silent. Windows stayed shut, curtains drawn tighter. Down the street, a woman hanging laundry thought she saw someone standing in the basement window, just a pale face behind the glass. But when she blinked, it was gone. In that neighborhood, people learned not to ask questions. They convinced themselves that what went on inside other homes was none of their concern. They told themselves that the noise they sometimes heard at night was the television. Not a cry for help. By autumn, Sylvia was rarely seen outside. Jenny would come out for groceries now and then, walking quickly with her head down. The seasons turned, and still that same dim light glowed in the back room. It was the kind of horror that doesn't come with monsters or ghosts. It was the horror of people choosing not to see. When the authorities finally stepped inside, the house smelled of dust, rust, and something else, a sadness that seemed to cling to the walls. They would never fully understand how so much cruelty could hide behind such ordinary walls. Years later, the property was torn down. The lot turned into a small patch of grass. Nothing remains now but the wind that moves through it. But residents say the air there never feels quite right. Some nights, when the wind picks up from the east, it carries with it the faint sound of someone crying. Not loud, just enough to make you stop and listen, wondering if it's only your imagination. Because the truth is, every neighborhood has a house like that, a place that once held too many secrets, where silence became a weapon. And sometimes, even after the building is gone, the silence remains. The silence remains. After the house was gone, people thought the story would fade with it. They thought that if they tore down the walls, the screams would stop echoing. But the ground remembers things people wish it. DIDN, single quotes T. The empty lot on East New York Street looked harmless enough. Children crossed it on their way to school. Dogs dug shallow holes where the old foundation once was. And weeds grew tall against the broken fence. Yet, if you stood there alone, you could feel it. The air pressed a little heavier, as if the earth itself wanted to speak, but had been silenced for too long. The first person who dared to build their bait again said his tools went missing at night. The workers complained that they could hear footsteps when no one was around. One man quit after hearing what he swore was a girl's voice whispering his name from the basement that no longer existed. It's easy to dismiss stories like that. People forget how guilt lingers, not in places, but in memories. And the town had plenty to feel guilty about. 4 months after the case broke, every newspaper carried Sylvia's face. A shy smile, soft eyes. She became a symbol, not just of what happened inside that house, but of what everyone else failed to stop. The trial was public, ugly, and filled with too many excuses. Neighbors testified, children were questioned, adults shifted blame. Each one repeated the same thing in their own way. We didn't know. We didn't hear. We thought someone else would help. But they had heard, and they had seen. The mailman who noticed the unopened letters, the neighbor who saw bruises that weren't there before, the teacher who asked once, "Are you okay?" and didn't ask again. Each of them carried that silence like a stone in their chest, and as years passed, they learned to bury it beneath everyday life. Still, something about that story refused to die. Journalists came from other states. True crime writers picked apart the evidence. Even decades later, students studying criminology would visit the site as if walking through a ghost story that just happened to be real. But it wasn't just journalists or students who felt drawn to that patch of ground. There were locals who claimed that sometimes, late at night, they'd see a flicker of light where the basement window used to be. Not bright, just a pale shimmer, like a candle flame behind glass. It would fade if you looked at it too long. One man swore he heard humming when he passed by after midnight, a soft, almost childlike tune. He turned, expecting to see someone, but the street was empty. The air smelled faintly of iron and old wood. It's strange how stories like this turn into hauntings, even when the real horror had nothing to do with the supernatural. Maybe the haunting isn't a ghost at all. Maybe it's the echo of our own cowardice, circling back to remind us what we chose not to see. A retired police officer who had been one of the first on the scene once told a reporter that he could never forget the basement door. He said it looked ordinary, cheap wood with peeling paint, but when he opened it, the air that came out was cold enough to make him shiver. It wasn't the temperature, he said quietly, it was what it meant. For him, the nightmares never stopped. He moved away, changed his name. But every time he passed an old two-story house with a dim light glowing in the back room, his chest tightened. He said he could still hear that same faint cry, like the one from that night. Not loud, not violent, just pleading. Years turned into decades. The street changed. The houses aged. Families came and went. But no one stayed long in the house built on that lot. Renters moved out suddenly, leaving furniture behind. Some said they couldn't sleep because of knocking sounds under the floor. Others said the temperature would drop every night at exactly 3 a.m., even in July. The new owners always had explanations. Plumbing, wiring, drafts. The usual things people tell themselves to keep believing the world makes sense. But deep down, the town never forgot. Every October, people would leave a single white flower at the edge of the property. No one said who started it. By the mid-1980s, it had become a quiet ritual, a way to say sorry without saying anything at all. Some of those who lived through it are still alive. They talk about it rarely and only in whispers. They say that if you bring up her name inside that neighborhood, the air changes. The wind stops for just a moment, like it's listening. One woman who grew up nearby said that as a child, she used to dream of the house. She said she'd see a girl standing at the top of the basement stairs, her hand resting on the banister, her eyes wide with something between sadness and peace. In the dream, the girl never spoke. She only looked at her, as if to say, "You know now." The woman said she stopped having that dream after she went to the site and laid a flower there herself. The next morning, the dream was gone. There's a theory among paranormal investigators that places aren't haunted by ghosts, but by moments of intense emotion trapped in time. Fear, pain, grief. They leave a mark. You can tear down the walls, you can rebuild, but the air still remembers. And maybe that's what lingers on East New York Street. Not Sylvia herself, but everything she endured. Every scream that went unheard. Every plea that was ignored. It's as if the world keeps replaying the moment in an endless loop, waiting for someone to finally listen. The strangest part, even the people who never knew her, who only read about the case years later, say they feel something when they hear her name. a tightening in the chest, a coldness that isn't quite fear, but close to it. Maybe it's empathy. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe both. Because the truth is, horror doesn't end when a door closes. It lives in every silence that follows. In every neighbor who looks away. In every person who says, "That's not my problem." The house on East New York Street is gone, but the story of Sylvia Likens will never leave. Not because of what was done to her, but because of what everyone else allowed to happen. And sometimes, when the night is still and the air hangs heavy, that's when people swear they can hear it again. A faint scream, soft, far away, like the basement is still there, somewhere beneath the earth, still echoing, still waiting to be heard, still waiting to be heard. It was years later when the story found me. I wasn't looking for it, not really. I was researching haunted places in Indiana for a documentary when the name Sylvia Likens appeared in an old forum thread. The post was brief, written by someone who claimed they grew up near East New York Street. They said that even after the house was torn down, no one could stay there long. They said the ground breathed sadness. I didn't believe in curses, not until I stood there myself. The lot was empty when I arrived, fenced off, grass growing in uneven patches, a single tree standing in the middle like it had been guarding the place for years. The afternoon light was dim, the sky hanging low and gray. You could still hear the city in the distance, traffic, kids shouting, but the space around me felt quiet in a way that made your skin tighten. I started recording. This is the site where the Likens house once stood, I said into the camera, my breath visible in the cold. A story people tried to forget. The wind stirred the weeds. There was no sound for a moment, and then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze, thinking it was the fence. But the noise didn't stop. 3 taps, then silence, then 3 again, spaced apart like a heartbeat. It wasn't wind. It wasn't footsteps. It was something else. Something deliberate. I called out, "Hello." But the word fell flat, as if the air swallowed it. My camera picked up a flicker of interference, a single frame glitching like static. Later, when I replayed the footage, I saw it. For less than a second, in the corner of the frame, there was movement. A shadow near the base of the tree. Not a shape, not a figure, just movement. Like light bending wrong. I told myself it was nothing. Compression, glare, my mind playing tricks. But when I walked closer, the tapping started again, louder this time, echoing faintly like it came from below. The ground was cold under my boots. That night, in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound, slowed it down, cleaned the audio. Underneath the tapping, there was something else, a whisper, barely audible, broken by static. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like a name. The next morning, I went to the archives, old newspapers, police reports, yellowed pages filled with words that didn't seem real, neighbors describing what they heard, a teacher saying she had a bad feeling. Everyone had seen something. Everyone had felt it. I found one article that never made it to print, written by a reporter named Harold Jenkins. His notes said, visited site after sentencing, heard crying from basement. Basement was empty. Sound stopped when light was turned on. I looked for Jenkins. He'd died in 1987, heart attack, age 51, but his daughter still lived in the city. When I met her, she told me her father was never the same after that story. She said he'd wake up at night drenched in sweat, whispering the basement is still there. She handed me something, an old cassette tape. He made this after the trial, she said. He wanted to record what he heard. The label read simply, Basement -1966. I hesitated before playing it. The tape hissed for a few seconds, then a voice, her father's calm, steady, testing, 1, 2, then silence. A few seconds later, a faint knock, 3 times, then another pause, then a soft, broken sound, like someone trying not to cry. The rest of the tape was static, When it ended, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I didn't sleep that night either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty lot, the tree, the fence, the air hanging thick with something unspoken. It wasn't about ghosts anymore. It was about memory, about the kind of pain that seeps into the ground and never leaves. Over the next few weeks, I talked to more people, old neighbors, a retired police clerk, a man who said he helped carry out evidence from the house. Every story was the same. The smell, the silence, the feeling that something unseen was still there. One man told me, "It's like the ground keeps breathing her name." Another said, "You can feel when you're being watched, even if no one's there." At first, I thought they were just haunted by guilt. But then, it started happening to me. I'd be editing late at night, and the temperature in my apartment would drop. Not by much, just enough to notice. My phone would light up on its own. Once, my recorder turned on without me touching it. The display showed the word "recording" for a full minute before shutting off. When I checked the file, it was empty, except for 3 faint knocks. I told myself it was interference, faulty equipment, but deep down, I knew. I'd spent too long in that place, digging through memories that weren't mine to disturb. Sometimes when I closed my eyes, I could hear that same sound from the tape. Soft, broken, pleading, not angry, not vengeful, just tired. It wasn't a haunting. It was a reminder. Sylvia's story was never about ghosts or curses. It was about silence, the kind that kills. The kind that spreads when good people look away. And I started to realize something else. The screams that people said they heard from the basement. Maybe they weren't trapped in that house. Maybe they're still echoing in every place where cruelty hides behind normal walls. Every home where someone stays quiet because it's not their business. That's the real horror. The silence that keeps repeating. By the end of that month, I stopped the documentary. I couldn't finish it. Some stories aren't meant to be filmed. Some should only be remembered, whispered, softly, like a prayer. But I still keep the tape. I still hear it sometimes in the background, under the noise of life. 3 knocks. Then quiet. And for a moment, the whole world holds its breath, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to finally answer. I went back one last time. It had been years since I first stood on that lot, but something about it kept pulling me back, like a thread tied around my heart that wouldn't let go. The city had changed. New roads, new faces. But when I turned onto East New York Street, it all went quiet again, just like before. The empty lot was still there, overgrown now, the fence leaning, the tree larger, its roots cutting through the earth like veins. The grass had grown tall enough to hide the scars of where the foundation once was, but the air still felt the same, heavy, unmoving, watching. I didn't bring a camera this time, no recorder, no questions, just a single white flower. As I walked to the center of the lot, I could feel it again, the stillness that sits between heartbeats. A faint wind brushed past my neck, though the leaves didn't move. I placed the flower down and whispered her name, almost afraid to hear it said aloud. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, somewhere far beneath my feet, there was a sound, soft, distant, like the closing of a door, and with it came a feeling I can't explain. Not fear, not sadness, but release. Like the air itself had finally exhaled. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. I turned to leave, and as I reached the gate, I looked back once more. The light was fading, the sky painted orange and gray, and for just a second, just long enough to make me doubt myself, I thought. I saw her standing by the tree, smiling, not trapped, not broken, just free. Then, she was gone. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was something else. But as I walked away, the world felt lighter. The screams were gone. The basement, the ghosts, the guilt, all of it had gone quiet. Some stories don't end in fear. They end in remembrance, and sometimes that's enough to finally let the silence rest.